I speak to you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We're not all 10, made clean. The 9, where are they? Seems no one has come back to give thanks except this foreigner. An airline pilot wrote that on this particular flight, he'd hammered his ship into the runway really hard. The airline had a policy which required the first officer to stand at the door while the passengers exited. Give a smile and saying, "Thanks for flying XYZ airline." He said that in light of his bad landing, he had a hard time looking at the passengers in the eye, thinking someone would have a smart comment, and no one seemed annoyed. Finally, everyone had gotten off except for one little old lady walking with a cane. She approached, and he thanked her for flying the airline, and then she asked conspiratorially, "Sonny, mind if I ask you a question?" "Why, no, ma'am. What is it?" "Did we land or were we shot down?" You know, the Airbus 320 took off from LaGuardia at 3:25 p.m. On its ascent to an intended 15,000 feet, at the 2,700 foot level, the pilot saw a flock of big brown birds hitting their windshield. Suddenly, both engines lost thrust. Sullenberger took over the controls while his co-pilot tried to figure out procedures as to how to get the engines restarted. Passengers were aware of the impact and the sudden loss of thrust. They feared the worst. Sullenberger contacted LaGuardia, and they cleared the runway for him and grounded all flights. But Sullenberger suddenly radioed that he was unable to return. He asked for clearance to another airport, got that, couldn't make that one either. Casting in his mind for solutions to ditch the plane, he decided to do so on the Hudson River, chose a location close to the ferry terminal in the proximity of boats. Passed a messenger to all passengers, "Brace for impact." Flight crew went into action to brief all passengers as to how to do that. They all thought this was the end. Young mother texted her husband goodbye, saying she loved him and the children and prepared to die. Meantime, the plane was coming down fast. Sullenberger did an amazing job of landing the thrustless plane steadily for a flawless emergency landing on the water. Once landed, the flight attendants leapt into action. One passenger panicked and opened the rear door, and water began to flood in. Others were starting to walk on the top of the seats from back to front. Life rafts were deployed out the doors as the plane began to sink. One person in a wheelchair was evacuated with great difficulty onto the wings. All 155 got out of the plane as rescue boats began to arrive. There were injuries that were handled, including hypothermia, as the water was just above freezing. Sullenberger himself walked the empty plane twice before leaving himself to make sure absolutely that there was nobody on board. Then he stepped out onto the wing for rescue. The gratitude for what he had done was awesome. Every passenger and every passenger's family were overjoyed. The entire flight crew was honored with a Master Medal from the Guild of Pilots and Navigators. President Bush thanked Sullenberger and his crew. President-elect Obama congratulated them. Mayor Bloomberg thanked Sullenberger. The media did endless positive interviews. People were delighted all over the world as well as the American people. There was this wave of gratitude that swept over the news media as survivors told their stories. In a world of so much desperate news, there was suddenly this good news of heroism, of people caring for each other in an awesome way. And briefly, very briefly, our common humanity surfaced in pure healing gratitude. You know, when the historical Jesus walked the streets of Palestine, he was asked for hard things in terms of healing. There are many forms of skin disease classified as leprosy in biblical times. Leprosy in its worst form was a terribly dreadful disease. Lepers were isolated and had to cry out that they were unclean whenever they approached people. Often it was a slow death sentence where a person, through loss of sensation, could damage or lose fingers, arms, legs, deterioration of the optic nerve, and thus lose their sight. So one would think that when they actually got healed, they'd be very grateful, right? Well, perhaps they were, but the story's in the record for one reason. Only one man came back to give thanks, and he was a foreigner. Now, Jesus was very aware of people other than Jews, and often used them as examples to teach, like his story of the Good Samaritan, or his encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. This little leper story again lifts up the right action of a non-Jew, controversial in Jesus' day, where tribalism was so strong. Remember, too, that Jesus' first sermon in Nazareth got him into trouble because he lifted up a foreign woman and Naaman the Syrian. So we know for these reasons that this little story is authentic to the tradition of the historical Jesus. He cared for foreign nationals living in Palestine. He was not above citing their virtues to an intolerant audience, no matter what the cost. But whenever he did that, the light on the issues became stronger. And at the heart of this story is that Jesus appears to be surprised at the behavior of the 9 others who did not return to give thanks. Thus, Jesus, it appears, expected to be thanked, wanted God to be acknowledged rather than taken for granted. It was not all about the lepers. It was also about God's compassionate action as well. So Jesus, like the rest of us, wanted to be thanked. And we can imply through Jesus, who represented what God was like to us so clearly, that God also wanted to be thanked. Do we do that? That's the point of this little story. It's also the point of every worship service, and it's one major reason we gather for worship every week, to give thanks with a grateful heart. Done right, a good worship service can transform the week through gratitude. But have you ever asked yourself why it's sometimes so difficult to be grateful? You know, as little children, you and I were brought up to say thank you as good manners. What do you say? We would say to our children, and then would come back a perfunctory thank you. Are we unwittingly teaching our children that we should say thanks and they can do so without any kind of deep feelings, just polite? But gratitude is not about being polite. It's all about feelings. For instance, if Sullenberger had just saved your son's life, your thank you would not be perfunctory, but heartfelt. When you saw him, you'd want to shake his hand, look him in the eye, and say, thank you. Possibly hug him. You'd want to know just how grateful you were. You know, some of us feel diminished if we say thank you when someone has helped us, so we remain silent. We should have been able to do this ourselves, we think, so we're not grateful. And when we do not express genuine gratitude, we cheat the world and ourselves. If we want to live meaningfully, we can add a smile or a hug or some tangible way of appreciating another person. For gratitude recognizes the blessings we received and the wonder of another person. Why would we hold that back? Some folks think if we say thank you, then we now owe something in return. So we say nothing for tactical reasons. But when we do this, we only hurt ourselves, for being grateful is a normal, natural response. If we're self-centered and we think it's all about us, then who needs to be grateful? We're self-sufficient. We don't need help. We don't engage in team playing. We can do it all on our own. Captain of the plane, the physician surgeon who operated, the rabbi who healed us, they're just doing their job. They're professionals. Professionals just don't need thanks. They're supposed to do that kind of stuff. That's what they're paid to do. A lack of gratitude cheats the world, and above all, cheats us. Why? Because all of us experience moods. Get up in the morning and say, "My God, thank you for this beautiful day," or, "My God, another day." Now, which statement makes you feel better? Happy people know this truth. When we're happy, we are truly grateful. The reverse is also true. When we're grateful, we're truly happy. You and I live in a very depressing world at the moment. Turn on the news and we hear news of fresh disasters. The Middle East is in turmoil. Refugees are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Retaliatory attacks have destroyed half of the buildings in Gaza, killed over 25,000 Palestinians. Over 1 million people are in Rafah, and Israel is being warned by the world not to go in there in a ground operation when Hamas is shielding themselves with civilians, firing rockets from hospitals. You know, the USA has hit targets in Yemen. It goes on, doesn't it? And it's nearly 98% bad news. You know, this can't help but affect us. So we move into coping modes of escapism. We switch the news channel and we get into sports. Is it the Taylor Swift Super Bowl, or is it the Clydesdales Super Bowl? And how many times will the camera switch to Taylor Swift in her box, and should we bet on that? This is distracting ourselves, don't you think? Pretty good job. 60,000 people will distract themselves with that this afternoon, plus the millions watching. Probably some of us, probably me. You know, we get into Christmas, or a big birthday, or a wedding celebration. Hopefully it's all fabulous, but what if that relative does her passive-aggressive stuff in your home or at the celebration, and you were the target? What then? You were trying so hard, but that difficult person has just pushed all of your buttons. The good news is this: there's an antidote. Gratitude. Start thinking about something to be grateful for. And don't make it global, like, "Isn't life wonderful?" Be specific. Be thankful for your car that's running perfectly, the roof over your head, the food on the table, the shoe that happens to fit us, the Christmas and New Year's birthday card that come in the mail, the computer you're using, the water in the tap, the electricity, the heat in the radiator. You know, there are endless things to be thankful for. So start thinking about these things rather than sinking into the negative. As St. Paul said, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there's any excellence and anything is worthy of thanks, dwell on these things. The things you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice all of these things, and then something quite wonderful will happen. The peace of God will be with you. What a promise that is. Rather than being depressed and down in the mouth, that we can actually have the presence of the God of peace. For if we feel truly grateful, the presence of God will heal us to the bottom of our souls. Doug Setter from Winnipeg, Manitoba, was a sergeant in charge of an 8-man section of Canadian troops in the former Yugoslavia. In this day, he was involved with maintenance control, never-ending routine of repairing damages or replacing materials stolen by the desperate population that remained in bombed-out villages. This day, they were working on a defensive area they'd previously fortified with sandbags, chicken wire, and lumber. His men, one after another, went into complaining. Feeling no support from the Canadian media, little or none from the remaining locals who would look at them curiously or just ignore them, these men started with a litany of complaints. Why don't we just let the two sides go at it and sort it out? Isn't that what they want? As they entered into what was left of a house, one said, "Just look at this bloody mess." And Doug cut him off and said, "Let's just get the job done." Months ago, when he left Canada, Doug had been full of idealism about helping third world countries, the downtrodden and homeless children. But now, the reports of torture, beheadings, infanticides, executions were wearing on him. To him, what he was doing was becoming pointless. He'd be told by a local, "You get out of my country." The media criticism at home was relentless. Every day his men were into loud griping. He tried to tell his men to keep the griping down, but today he'd given up. He no longer cared. As his men were carelessly flinging supplies off the truck, he suddenly saw a young woman walking amongst the crumbling buildings and all the broken glass with a tray which smelled like coffee. She was slim, with well-kept dark hair. Her face was etched with worry lines. She had teeth missing from lack of dental care at all. She offered the coffee tray to him hostess style. Doug brought that up to say thank you, but his mother thought that the show no favoritism rule could be bent just a little, so he gave her thanks from his heart. "Over here," he hollered to his men. "Come on for a coffee break." "Thank you," he said, accepting one of the small cups of floating coffee grounds. He sipped it carefully as one by one his men took the cups like kids after candy. It was warm, strong, and bitter, but it was powerful. He replaced the cups with another big thank you. She flashed him that sweet, missing, toothless grin, and then walked away amongst the rubble. Her head was held high, and her walk was proud. Doug wondered how she could be like that after losing everything. For all he knew, that might be her very last cup of coffee. And there they were, 6 healthy, fit Canadian soldiers with food in their bellies, money in their banks, a few $1,000s of dentistry in their mouths. Back home in Canada, they all had homes and families who were safe and waiting for their return. The men all began thinking about the same thing. For the next few hours, sweat poured off them, running water like they worked extra hard into the afternoon. Only now, there wasn't a single gripe from any one of them. That's what gratitude does. Let's make heartfelt thanksgiving our whole way of life. Happiness lies that way.